Hello, church. Today's psalm, Psalm 119, is famous for being the longest psalm. At 176 verses, it is also the longest chapter in the Bible. It was written as an expanded acrostic poem and has 22 stanzas, each having 8 verses, corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, so that each of the 8 verses in a single stanza all start with the same letter of the alphabet. That doesn't all translate so well into English, or at all, but it goes to show how expertly crafted this psalm is. It really is a masterpiece of literature. But today I won't read the whole 176 verses, just one stanza, verses 105 through 112. The word of the Lord. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. I have sworn an oath and confirmed it, to observe your righteous ordinances. I am severely afflicted. Give me life, O Lord, according to your word. Accept my offerings of praise, and teach me your ordinances. I hold my life in my hand continually, but I do not forget your law. The wicked have laid a snare for me, but I do not stray from your precepts. Your decrees are my heritage forever. They are the joy of my heart. I incline my heart to perform your statutes forever to the end. The whole of Psalm 119 is best summed up by its first line. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. All 176 of the verses are dedicated to God's law, praising it, explaining its value, and recognizing its necessary place of prominence in our lives. These verses in particular do the same thing, but through the metaphor of light and dark. The psalmist describes life as a journey through a dark and dangerous world, full of traps that others have set. And it is only by the light of God's law can the psalmist navigate through life and avoid the traps and dangers that have been set by others. Or simply put, God's word guides us through life and helps us avoid the traps of sin. But ever since Paul wrote to the Romans, it would seem that we no longer think of God's law like this psalm describes it. In eloquence and truth, Paul wrote that God's law was impossible to bear, stating that everyone falls short and that we need grace that was won for us on the cross. Which is true, it's absolutely true. But it also does not nullify Psalm 119. Or God's law in its totality. It's apples and oranges, really. Paul was writing about the impossibility of using the law to achieve righteousness. And if the law is your only means to prove yourself worthy and righteous before God, then we are all doomed in the impossibility of the task. No one can earn that level of holiness before God. But the psalmist wasn't trying to use the law to prove his own worth to God, but to successfully navigate through the traps and dangers of life. And unless we let the tail wag the dog, these are two very different approaches to the teachings of God. The law was not given as a burden by which you were meant to prove yourself to God. If it were, there would be no need to include provisions of forgiveness that would then seem to predetermine failure. It would almost be as if God was setting us up to fall short, which doesn't make sense. So what Paul was describing was actually a misapplication of God's laws. In truth, God's laws were given to do just what the psalmist describes, to live life. And as with many aspects of reading the Bible, this comes down to a prescriptive versus descriptive kind of difference. When God promises in Deuteronomy that those who follow the law and live by it will have a prosperous life, you can either read that prescriptively or descriptively. Prescriptively sounds like Paul was denouncing that God would give special blessings and favor to those who earned it with good behavior, as if you could do enough of the law to earn a level of righteousness, and then God would reward you for that. Descriptively reads more like what the psalmist is saying by stating a natural consequence, that those who live by God's laws we'll have a good life because God's laws help us avoid the snares of sin and the troubles of life. And this distinction might sound like semantics, but it is crucial. Jesus spent much of his time trying to teach the religious leaders of his day that they should not use the law to manipulate or burden or control the people, especially when it came at the expense of the people. Rather, Jesus taught that his burden should be light and easy to carry. And even more directly, Jesus said that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So if we read Paul as saying that God's law is too much to bear, so we shouldn't even try, then not only are we misreading Paul, but also Jesus and Deuteronomy and Psalm 119 and probably the entirety of the Bible. And if we continue to insist that God's laws are simply a list of do's and don'ts that prevent us from doing the things we want while making us do what we don't want to do, then we don't understand God's law at all. The Torah was given for the same reason that parents tell their children to look both ways before crossing the street, or not to hit your siblings, or to wash your hands. In fact, many of the rules of the Torah even sound like these three examples. There are rules about living cleanly and how to take care of yourself and your hygiene. There are rules about how to keep you safe from danger, and even rules and laws on how to help you treat one another. And while they might sound strange how they're written to our 21st century ears, the intent is still what the psalmist is trying to describe. God's laws were given as a light to our feet, or a lamp to our path, so that we could see the safe and good way to go through life, while avoiding the traps set by others, and the pitfalls and dangers of sin. So these are not a burden, but a blessing, a gift. And if I haven't convinced you yet, then let me try one more time with a modern twist. If life were some sort of booby-trapped temple in an Indiana Jones movie, then God's law would be the map that showed you where to go and how to avoid all the traps along the way. Not only would such a map not be a burden, but you would be glad you have it. And you would even thank the one who gave it to you for saving your life and for helping you on your way. And this is how the psalmist sees and describes God's laws. And it is an apt description. But does the psalmist's description of God's law match how we view it? Do we see it the same way? To find out, just spend a few seconds thinking of what you consider to be the hardest, most difficult part of God's law for you personally. And once you have that in mind, ask yourself if you think of it as a burden that holds you down, that prevents you from doing the things that you want to do, or if you can see it as good advice that would improve your life, even if it is difficult. Now, this difference in perspective can drastically impact how we relate to God's Word and how we apply it to our lives. If we constantly think of God's Word as impossible and miserable restrictions, then we will be less likely to try to implement it than we would if we just recognize the value that it brings to our lives. The challenge for all of us is to be aware of this dynamic and to push ourselves to see God's Word, God's laws, as guidance in a positive light that benefits our lives rather than restricts it. What has been passed down to us and handed down to us is not so much legal code as much as it is tips or tricks of the trade that help us to navigate life. The commands like not lying aren't there to prevent us from getting away with things. They're there to help us avoid getting into even more problems and more trouble. What's been given to us isn't do's and don'ts. Rather, it is the map that helps us guide ourselves through this life. And if we can figure out how to read it that way and how to think of it that way, the burden that we often feel or the impossibility that we often feel with things like loving our neighbor become less burdensome and more helpful. So the challenge for all of us this week and every week is to try to understand God's laws the way that the psalmist sees it, especially in these verses in 119. So may God bless you and keep you. May God make God's face to shine upon you and give you peace. And may the word of the Lord guide you through life as a light to your feet and a lamp to your path.